and quite interestingly, a licensed pilot. And he's a Java champion and Kotlin developer expert, a rockstar presenter, and more famously, the author of the O'Reilly book, Spring Boot Up and Running. It's a great book. If you haven't already read it, I encourage you to go pick it up. In his work, Mark tries to create awareness on how developers can create innovative production-ready software at velocity for cloud and edge computing. Both things becoming more and more popular with companies. And I also encourage you to follow Mark on Twitter at on his handle MK Heck HECK. So that's about Mark. And on today's topic, Mark will take us through a live coding adventure to demonstrate how to create candidate functions using the power of Spring Boot, right? So, Spring Boot is something that most developers work with. So, why not use some of the functionality that Spring Boot supports, and also use Spring Cloud Functions and Azure Cloud Functions to sort of, integrate everything in the cloud, and also along the way, see some of the potential welcome discoveries that could really help us build high performance applications on the cloud. In all, I think this session will help us incorporate functions into our applications in a manner that improves performance, optimizes cost, and adds great flexibility to the software. So Mark, thanks for taking the time out to join us, and this really is kind of you to have agreed to do this with us, and really privileged to have you join us today. Over to you.
Absolutely thrilled to be here, Shashi. Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone, or to everyone, for having me. Times, we were just talking about time zones are a thing. So it's morning here, it's evening there, and yet it still works. I love this. So I'm going to launch in as soon as I share my screen. And I do have some, let's see, I'll do the inception thing. We'll do that. And I'll share that, and then I'll move. Let's see, it moved it off automatically. That's wonderful. Sometimes that actually even works, so that's a good thing. Let me switch to what I want to start with, though, which is the presentation. I keep things pretty light in terms of presentations because I feel like most of us live in the code most of the time. So I do think it's helpful, however, to set some context, because it's just like when you pull up a mapping app on your phone, regardless of which one you use, you look at the map for context, and you look at the turn-by-turn directions to make sure you have exactly down what you want to do. So the context, the map, if you will, is the presentation. So I start with that and then dive right into the turn-by-turn here in a little bit. So welcome to this evening's, I guess, session on Let's Get Functional, or as I like to say, the fast path to smart serverless with Spring Cloud Function and Azure Functions. And as Shashi mentioned, my name is Mark Heckler. I'm a principal cloud advocate of Java and JVM languages with Microsoft. Former Spring team member, came to Microsoft a couple of years ago now during the pandemic. And I'm still doing a lot of the same things. I just have maybe a little bit broader toolbox to use, which is always cool because it kind of combines the best of all worlds, in my opinion, which is Spring capabilities, Spring library, Spring functionality, with just a superb cloud platform and many, many options, which I'll cover a couple of those today. I'm primarily talking about functions, but there are several ways to get there from here. The old all roads lead to Rome. Maybe not, but we can certainly explore different paths. So again, the bad news is we have a short time together today. The good news is we have, relatively speaking, a nearly unlimited amount of time afterward. So if you're like me and you think of the best questions, comments, or feedback 10 minutes after you disconnect, walk away, whatever, it happens. So reach out to me via either of my emails. Those work, markheckler@microsoft.com or mark@thehecklers.com. But best yet is Twitter. I am also on Mastodon and a couple of other different options. But kind of Twitter has that center of gravity, like it or not. So that's probably the best starting point. I check it the most frequently. I check email sometimes, but it's best to reach out to me on Twitter at mkheck, and we can always branch out from there if we need to go long form. So a bit about me. I am an architect and developer by background, and as you can tell, obviously an advocate I'm also an author. I have co-authored a couple of books. I contributed content and code to several other books. I solo authored a book a couple of years ago, as mentioned, and I will mention that again here momentarily, just to give a little more information, as well as a link to hopefully a short-term free trial if you haven't read it yet. I am a Java champion, Java 1 Rockstar, Groundbreaker ambassador, Kotlin developer expert, and a licensed instrument-rated pilot, as Shashi mentioned. I love the idea of getting a different perspective on things, literally and physically. And being a pilot allows you to see things from a different perspective, a few thousand feet up in the air. And yes, it is feet. Interestingly, we have a kind of a melange of different measurements and numbers and systems that we use in aviation. I kind of do know why, but it's interesting that we measure temperatures in Celsius, we measure distances in nautical miles, we have statute miles, we have inches of mercury as far as pressure or hectopascals. So, I mean, there are a lot of different things that we deal with. It makes it kind of fun and stretches your brain in different ways. And I do actually fold that into my demos now, so as you'll see momentarily as well. Here's the latest book. This I'm really proud of, not because I felt like I did everything perfectly, but because with any book, with any content you create, whether it's videos or writing, there are always things that you, as a creator and author, have to decide whether to include or not include, or how much weight to give, or and you never feel like it's perfect because there are too many constraints and there's just too much great material. But what I hopefully have done is give a different perspective and clarify some things and bring to light some things that maybe weren't covered the same way that other authors have done. Pardon me. And I have good friends and colleagues and fellow colleagues or former colleagues who have written other great spring books of various different stripes. But I did feel like there was a perspective missing, some material that I could maybe amplify on and contribute. So I did. If you're interested in checking the book out, the book also has a Twitter account at Spring Boot Book. If you go to that or follow the link, but the link is in the Twitter bio as well, you can actually sign up for, I think it's a 7-day free trial for Safari Books Online through O'Reilly, and check it out if you haven't already. Or you can find it at your local bookstore or what have you. So the plan for today. I love a good quote. I wish I were witty enough to create great quotes, but what I do is appreciate those who can create them. And this was stated by Leonard Bernstein, who was the former conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and a composer several years ago, who once said, "To achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." And we have both of those today. So let's get started. So for a quick overview, here's kind of what I want to accomplish in our short time together today. And I'm trying to watch the clock here so I don't keep anyone late. But we'll aim for somewhere in there. And I hear my dog over there snoring. So hopefully, that's just so you know, it's not me. I mean, you'll be able to tell. So I like to talk about when to app and when to function. And by that, what I mean is there are a lot of times that we look at bits of functionality, capabilities, and we think, well, it's not a massive amount of functionality. It's a smaller, vital bit of capability that I want to employ, that I want to deploy, if you will. And I wonder whether I should deploy that as an application, a full-on application, or as a function. And of course, when it falls neatly into either camp, that's not necessarily a problem. But when it kind of straddles that middle ground, you start to question, what's the best way forward? I don't necessarily talk a lot about the financial considerations, although they're definitely there, and I will mention those down the road. But what I try to do is kind of look at it from an engineering perspective first. And once we kind of discuss that, at least briefly, we roll into why Spring Cloud function and why Azure functions, and then we just launch into the code, quite frankly. So here's my starting point, right? And this is very cursory, very simple, and it doesn't include all of the logic that goes into it. We're all constantly analyzing things. We all have new data that's filtering into our decision-making processes on a daily or even hourly basis at times. But this is my starting point. Usually I take a bit of functionality and I kind of consider a couple of things. Is there a low time between calls? So meaning that if you just finish requesting that functionality and well, I say you, but something requests that functionality, another application, another service, what have you, and then something just reaches out again and requests that same functionality. If there's a low time between those calls, chances are it's going to be constantly employed, right? So it's going to be very busy. You should probably consider making that an always on application. Let's say there's not a low time between calls. There's a very long time between calls. So if it's a call that takes place once an hour, let's say very, very sporadically, or maybe even once or twice or 3 times a day, there's not a low time between calls. It finishes quickly. It executes quickly. Well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. There's not a low time between calls. So there's a vast amount of time between the calls. Is it long running? So by that, what I mean is if it only executes once an hour, but it takes 59 minutes to execute and satisfy the request, then you really, even though there's not a low time between calls, it's busy most of the time, right? So even though it's called once an hour, it executes 59 minutes, it's going to be on more than it's off, considerably more than it's off. So if it's long running, if it's not a low time between call, but it is long running, then yes, it still should probably be an app. If there's not a low time between calls, so it happens very sporadically, and it's very quick to execute. So take it back to that same scenario. Something is called once an hour, and it executes in 3 seconds. So it's idle for 59 minutes and 57 seconds every hour, right? Then it probably should be a function. Again, just speaking to it from the functionality, the engineering perspective. Now, notice at the bottom middle, some caveats apply because there are always exceptions. There are always edge cases. And then, of course, you get into the matter of the financial constraints or the considerations. So with most functions, you get a certain number of free executions or completely gratis executions provided by your cloud platform provider. Sometimes even with applications, you get those as well. And I'll mention that again, a little bit more as we go down the road. I always hesitate to throw specific financial numbers into a prezo because it seems like the sales folks change those every so often. So when it comes time to do make a decision based on functionality you're wanting to deploy, it makes a lot of sense to do a proof of concept of your application, your code, your functionality. As either or both, preferably both, a function or an application, and then to evaluate the current pricing as of that moment, and then to keep an eye on it as time moves on, of course. So I'm going to stop and take a little drink. I hear myself getting a little wispy already. I'll drink coffee until I get too wispy, and then I'll switch to water because I've noticed coffee kind of makes my tongue fuzzy, but it's so good, right? Caffeine is good. Okay, so why Spring Cloud Function? Well, if you haven't if you have used Spring Boot, I'll start there. You probably are aware of the power, the capabilities that it gives you. Spring Boot and the Spring projects, umbrella of projects, are very much developer focused and what I call developer first. And by that, what I mean is there are a lot of things that anytime you base something on Spring Boot that are kind of provided for you on your behalf. So things like auto configuration, things like simplified dependency management and simplified deployment. So auto configuration, based on your code, your annotations, the beans that you create, your dependencies, there are certain conditions that are met or not met, conversely, that allow your application to kind of self-configure. So for instance, I always go back, I try to start with a simple example because I think most of us grok that and then can fairly quickly see the more complex applications of it. So something like a database connection. If you in your class path, if you're in your dependencies, have a database driver and you have a Spring Data module, it kind of makes sense that you're going to want to talk to that database, right? So if you have MongoDB database driver and Spring Data Mongo, that probably signals to your application. I mean, this is something we look at and you go, obviously you want to talk to a database with that application. So it configures things for you if you include and extend an interface that's defined in Spring Data, and you have MongoDB on your class path. Again, I'm using those as an example, but whether you're using JPA and MySQL or Postgres or what have you, the results are the same, right? Because just by providing that bit of information with a Spring Boot startup or ahead of time evaluation, what happens is your application is aware enough to know that you want to interact with that data store. This isn't rocket science. It's just a very logical progression of evaluation and configuration. Now, we are used to, in many cases, if you're coming from a non-Spring Boot environment, we're used to doing all of that by hand. But when you see that it happens exactly the same way every time, you do start to think, why isn't this auto-configured? And in the Spring Boot world, it is. So with Spring Cloud Function, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, with Spring Cloud Function, you get the power and the capabilities of Spring Boot, that developer first focus, while still keeping the abstraction to a very minimum amount. Now, what do I mean by that? Spring Cloud Function is built around the idea of Java functions. So you take an object of something, an object of type T, you somehow manipulate that, transform that, and provide an object of that type or another type coming out of the other side. And the level of abstraction is such that it is literally a Java function. So you don't get the Spring, any kind of the Spring specifics to that. It is literally a Java function. So your abstraction, your potential for drift is minimal /0. So it gives you the capability to keep very close to the, well, I'll call it bare metal, but you know what I mean. Keep close to the bare metal, while still getting the goodness and the power and the capabilities of Spring Boot surrounding you and working on your behalf. So then, why Azure Functions? Well, Azure Functions give you a lot of capabilities in terms of a cloud platform, a global cloud platform, highly available. You have a lot of different, for one thing that I particularly am fond of is a lot of different trigger functions that allow you to execute a Spring Cloud function based on a number of different triggers coming from a number of different things. So whether it's a messaging platform like Kafka or RabbitMQ or Event Hubs, whether it's a database trigger, an HTTP trigger, you have multiple different ways to execute a particular function defined as a Spring Cloud function, and call that and execute it and cleanly wrap up and again, deploy that to a cloud platform that allows you to have a certain number of free executions and then a very low cost execution charge for each time after that high level of free executions is completed. And then I like to talk about a third option. And I just have recently added this in because I feel like it's a viable option. As developers, we start looking at things and say, well, I wonder if you could do it this way and if it would make more sense or if it's more cost effective or, we're all looking for a better way, right? We should be. And there is another option that I want to explore and show you, time permitting. If not, then I already have something ready to go that I can show you quickly, but I'd like to show you how easy it is to convert to that and show some of the trade-offs as well. So with that, let's code. Hopefully you know this guy. Love him from the IT crowd. He just delightfully quirky, and yeah, that's all of us, hopefully. As he likes to say, got my weirdness and my sweet style. So let's stop there. And let's go over to, oh, whoops. Let's see. I want to do new. Whoops. Let's see that new. There we go. Start.spring.io. All right. So here's the Spring initializer. I do want to show you kind of my thought process on what I do when I'm going from an idea or a concept of a bit of functionality all the way through to deploying to production, right? And I guess let me back up one step further and establish a little bit more context. Talking is hard. I haven't had enough coffee yet, but I'll fix that now. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm a pilot. And in the US and most other countries, I know there are feeders. In fact, I just saw one, and I don't remember which major city it was in India, but there was a person who had, during the pandemic, moved to different places and kept moving his transmitter, his receiver / transmitter around with him and had this amazing feed set up. So there are global feeds of aircraft that are captured and shared based on a small device that you can set up with an antenna and grab these periodic pings, if you will, from aircraft and then share them so we can see kind of what's going on with aircraft around the world. And I run a couple of these. And what happens is in the US, and generally countries vary a little bit on this, but it's kind of variations on a theme. So in the US, we have what's called an ADS-B, or Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast System, which broadcasts about once a minute a position update from an aircraft in flight. So if an aircraft is within a certain number of miles, in my case, of where I have my feed set up, then what it does is it will capture this. It'll just listen in and grab this and then report this or save it down, or it actually shares it with the international system of aircraft that are flying through. So once a minute, if an aircraft is flying, let's say from east to west, it will give a position update, just kind of a ping to let everyone know where it is. And that supplements the radar that's provided, the ground-based radar, And it also helps keep two aircraft from trying to inhabit the same space at the same time, which is generally a very, very bad thing. So what I do is I grab this, anything that's within the area, and I just, again, record it, save it, send it up. And in this particular case that I'm doing is I have a couple of different applications that I've already built. And one's a full-blown application. It's called the Plane Finder. And what it does is it'll grab this when I request it. I actually don't have it running. I'll start the application running, but when I ping it, when I pull it, what I want it to do is feed that information to a couple of functions that I have running on my local machine, or will have running on my local machine. One of them is actually an Azure function, and you see that over here on the right-hand side. Let me expand that. And what that does is it just grabs the position. So every time it pulls or gets a position update from varying numbers of aircraft in the area, it will save that position or grab that position, I should say, and send it to the function, and the function will just spit it out and return it, right? It's very simple in this case, because again, simplicity wins the day, helps to understand concepts better, but it's sufficiently complex enough that it gives you hopefully some insights into what can happen, what can be done. So it grabs that position, and it also grabs the aircraft itself and sends that to a function. Let me switch to the other one here. There we go, and I'll expand that. So the Plane Finder will get a position. I've got everything parameterized. It will grab a position from the feed. It'll send the position itself and the aircraft information to two different functions, which then just bounce them back in this case. Nothing fancy, but it just works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start, I guess just keep things in order. I'm going to start this application. So Maven W, Spring, boot, run. And I'll just run the Plane Finder so we get that started. And then I want to go over to the position function, and I'm just going to Maven W, Azure functions, run. And I'll go ahead and get those started. So we have those running in the background. We see here that our Plane Finder service is up, running. It started on port 8080, so we can pull that. It's downloading new stuff. How wonderful. And that's why I start this now versus later. So let's go ahead and create our aircraft function. We have our position function, hopefully running or starting. We have our Plane Finder function. Let's go ahead and create our aircraft function now to provide that third leg, if we will, our two functions that we're sending data to upon request. So I'm going to use a Spring initializer. I'm going to, again, stay down the middle of the road here with Maven for my build system, Java for my language. I'm going to use a current version of Spring Boot, which is 3.0.5 at this point in time. I'm going to change the group to thehecklers.com. We'll change our artifact to AC fun SO for star of, right? And let's see, is that, yeah, that's good. Let's go with that. So aircraft function, and we have jar packaging, of course. We have Java 17 because it's current LTS version for a bit longer anyway. And I'm going to add the dependency for Spring Cloud function. Simple so far, right? I'm going to generate the project, drop that here on my desktop, and yeah, that'll work. And open that up. And I don't know why it always does that. And there we go. That's fine. Open. And let me expand that. And let me go back and just double check, make sure everything started properly. Yes, everything is running fine. We see that our position function is running. We see that it's accepting gets and post requests, get requests and posts at this location, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. Nothing ever goes wrong in live demos, of course. That's why I learned to check, right? So let's go to our POM. I do want to add one thing to our POM, because as it's currently configured, what happens is the application will start and process and stop, or potentially will process. We don't have anything defined yet in logic, but once we do, it would start and stop rather quickly. What I want to do is actually run it so we can see what's happening. So I'm going to add a dependency here. So dependency, and it will be Spring Cloud Starter Function Webflux, because I want to have the ability to have blocking or non-blocking IO here. And actually my this little window is right in the way of my Maven refresh. So let me just move that to the other screen. There we go. And I'll do a Maven refresh. And that's all I need to do for the POM right now for what I want to show you. I'm going to go to the application properties. I'm going to set my server port to 70. 7071, so we can avoid port conflicts. The default for Spring Boot is 8080. We already have our plane finder running on 8080. I typically like to keep the Azure functions at 70, 71, 2, 3, whatever. So I'm going to just put this at 70, 71, and we'll start from there. Now, again, this is kind of an insight into my mind, how I approach things when I'm developing a function. So I like to start simple and build out. So we'll start simple. I'm going to just create a bean here. And this will be a function that will take a string and yield a string. Come on here. Let's see. There we go. Import. And you notice that is just a Java function, right? So nothing fancy, nothing special. I'm going to call this echo. Let's see. I have to line up looking around my mic here, line up my fingers, echo. And I will take a string and I will return a string. Now we can do that. We can also get a little fancier. We can make a string buffer. We'll take S and we'll do a reverse toString. We can do anything, right? This is our application. This is our function. So this is it. What I'm going to do at this point is just show you the starting point, right? So I'm going to run this and go back here, and let me just go into there. Not that we have to, but I'm setting things up for later as well. Now I use HTTP instead of curl. It's curl for mortals. So I like to use that because it makes things a little cleaner. It also has certain sensible defaults, sort of like Spring Boot. Why type localhost if you know it's going to be localhost? If you omit it, it assumes localhost, so that's kind of nice. So I'm just going to send star of here. And we'll see what we get back. Did it start? It did start. Yes. Okay. So it reversed that. Now, of course, we don't have to reverse it. It's just again, a nice little way to do it. I'm going to just make this a -b so we get a bare input output and it keeps it a little cleaner. So yeah, simple stuff, right? But it demonstrates a concept. We have a Spring Cloud function that we've defined. We call it, it works, easy peasy. Now let's take this another step further. I want to create a bean here. If I can type, and we were going to create a function. We're going to take an object of type aircraft. We'll return an object of type aircraft. We'll call this AC, right? And before I do that, you may have noticed that it doesn't know what an aircraft is. So let's go ahead and create our aircraft class. I'm going to create an aircraft class. And I'm going to have certain member variables here, certain properties. So this will be a string ADS hex. That's the hex code I mentioned, the ADSB identifier. And we'll have an aircraft registration number and an aircraft type. Now I'm going to just use my IDE to generate some things here. NoArgs constructor. Need this for Azure functions, right? So we can do other things, but I'm going to go ahead and just drop that in there now. And then some things like niceties like getters and setters. We'll do that. And then we want our equals and hash code. That's good. Oops, let's see. And then we want our toString. There we go. Easy peasy. So let's go back up. So now we have our aircraft, right? So now I can go back over here and that's defined. So I'll just return. And we can take an aircraft in and we can say a new aircraft, right? We'll say ac.getHex, ac.getReg, ac.getType. And that's not really much of a transformation, is it? Let's go ahead and just say, let's see, this is our new type. Not much of a transformation either, but again, it keeps it simple. Now, I like to do a little bit more than that because I like to just show some things that can happen. And have a little visibility, really. That's more what I'm into here. So let's take this. We can print out our current aircraft coming in. Let's make things a little bit fancier than that. So hey, this is what I like to do for logs. You do what makes you happy. But you know, I wouldn't necessarily recommend sprinkling your logs with emoji on a normal basis, but you know, for demos, it kind of works. So let's go ahead and restart that now. And let's try it again. Building on small grains of sand until we have a massive masterpiece, hopefully, or something. Okay. Let's go ahead and try this again. Now I'm going to use the same thing that I did before, and we'll see what happens. At this point, it'll say, hey, look, I don't know what you're doing, what you want to do, and why is that? And it gives you a good idea right here in the message. Multiple functional beans were found, AC and echo, thus can't determine default function definition. Please use Spring Cloud function definition property to explicitly define it. That's what happens if you want a particular default function to execute, when you just call it without anything. Now, we can still do this, and this is what I'm going to do in this case. Because typically you don't necessarily define a gaggle of different endpoints within a function, because you want something to be fairly self-contained and small, and that's fine, that's good. But I want to just kind of again show you the possibility. So I'm going to pipe in an aircraft.json, and we actually both endpoints work, right? We've reversed our star of. We've also got this is our new type, Boeing 737. That's just an example from the aircraft JSON. So if I cat dev aircraft, boy, typing is just out the window here. There we go. We can see what I'm feeding in. So everything works as we would expect. That's Spring Cloud Function. Very simple, very clean, and very elegant. Now, that's great. When you develop something, it's really super useful to make sure it works, right? That's a great first starting point. But we need to get it to production. How do we get that to production and make it meaningful? Because until something is fielded, until something deploys to production, it's kind of just an academic exercise. It really, I won't say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't really count toward anything, right? So let's go ahead and figure out how we can deploy this to production. So I'm going to stop this. And the first thing I want to do is go back and do a little bit of modification to our POM file, because at this point, we're just running everything locally using Spring Cloud Function and Spring Cloud Starter Function Webflux. I'm going to go ahead and, well, just kind of take this in order. So I'm going to go ahead and skip up to the top. There are a few things that you can do, and deploying this to Azure Functions adds a bit of complexity, but it adds a lot of capability. So there we have it. So I'm going to add in our Azure Functions thin layout version. We need that because that way it can deploy things in a compact fashion to Azure Functions. And I want to make sure I version control that as well. The next thing I want to do is remove this. And I'm just going to comment this out because I have a use for this later, but we won't need this to make sure it keeps active. It keeps the function open, if you will, the application open to listen for requests coming in. But what we will need is our dependency, Azure Function dependency. And this is just our Spring Cloud Function adapter for Azure. This makes sure it works with and runs in Azure. The next thing I want to do is go down here to my Spring Boot Maven plugin and add in I want to add in the layout, the thin layout dependency of the Spring Boot Maven plugin. And again, this allows us to build that thin layout for deployment. And then I want to add in the plugin itself for Azure Functions. Now, I want to make sure that everything is up and running properly or configured properly. We have our function port set to 7071. I actually have a couple of files that will be created for you, but I want to create them because I have a little bit of a specific requirement for those. But you don't have to have these. I just add them because I want to do some tweaks to the minor tweaks. And everything looks pretty good there, right? So I think we're okay there. If not, I'll find out shortly, right? And I'll go ahead and rebuild that. I do want to go to the application properties, and no, that's good. That's good for the time being. So now the next thing I want to do is go and create those two files that I said I would need, right? So the first thing I do is go back over here, and I want to create a separate directory called Azure. It doesn't matter where you put these files as long as you point to them properly from your POM. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a file, and we'll call this host.json. And let's create some stuff here. So our host.json, let's see, we will need our version, right? And it kind of prompts you as you go to give you some ideas of what you will need or want to add. So the extension bundle, and this is we want the ID. Again, it's prompting us, telling us we want our Microsoft Azure Functions extension bundle. That's good. and then the version for that, and it prompts us for what we need there. So that's super simple, super easy. Let's go back over here and add our other file that we want, which is our local.settings.json. And this allows you, and this, again, I told you I'd give you a kind of a look inside my mind because we've taken things running locally. We've built a local Spring Cloud function. The next thing I want to do is build and execute a locally running Azure function. And then from there, we can deploy it to the cloud, right? But I want to make sure it runs all locally to kind of hammer out any issues that I might have. So let's see. The first thing I want to do is, let's see, is it ID? Never can remember this. I always have to kind of go back and like sanity check myself. Oh, I want to make sure it's not encrypted, is encrypted, because at this point, I just want everything open to where I can use it. That's good, right? In this particular case. And I want to provide some values here. So our runtime, we need to indicate that that's Java. And then this doesn't prompt you at all, but we need to specify our main class. The easiest way I know to make sure I don't have any typos, because typos do happen, is just to go here and grab and copy paste. And that way you just are sure you don't have any typos. So we'll add our package name here, and then we'll go back to our app name and grab that, and we'll add that in. So easy peasy. All right, so let's go now over to our application, and let's add in another class, and we'll call this our function component. Doesn't matter what you call it. This is just what I call it. But that way it lets me know that I need to create this as a component, right? And then I want to inject our function, right, that will take an aircraft and return an aircraft. And I'll just call this AC. I want to, oops, let's see. Come on, IntelliJ. There we go. And then I want to inject that, or automatically auto-wire that in. And the next thing I want to do is just define something by a function name. I'm going to call this AC, clever, right? And I want to make this a public function that returns an HTTP response message, right? And we'll call this AC fun, because it is fun, right? This is fun. And I'm going to take an HTTP, if I can spell, trigger, and I want to define the name for it, and we'll just call this request. And the methods, I should say, and I want to accept a get and a post in this case. And I want to define what my auth level is. And in this case, I want to make things anonymous so that we can call this from anywhere. Pardon me. And this will be an HTTP request message that we're taking, which accepts an optional of aircraft, and we'll call this request. That's good. And there we go. Oh, whoops. I was going to say, why is that not working right? It's an HTTP request message. That looks happier. All right. So how do we create our response message? Well, we will return. We'll take our request, I guess I should say. We'll start with that. And we'll create a response builder. I want to provide an OK status message. We want to indicate from our headers a content type of application /JSON, and we want to build our body. We'll start with the body here. We'll take our request. We'll do a get body and get, but we need to send that to or apply our function to that, right? So that looks good, and we'll build that, and that should be that. So we have our function, our Azure function, which is listening and triggered by an HTTP trigger, which then in turn calls our Spring Cloud function. I think I have everything defined that I need to have defined. If not, we'll soon find out, right? So let me go ahead and save that, and we'll go out and we'll do a build. So let's see, a /maven w clean package. And we'll let that run. I'll just double check I haven't missed anything obvious. If it's not obvious, then it's very easy to miss, right? And that gives me time for a sip. How are we doing on time? We're doing great. Good. Okay, so I'm just building this now. and making sure everything is, all the dependencies are in place. Yeah, it's just telling us, hey, version numbers, make sure there's everything's okay. It is, I can assure you it is. Famous last words, right? So Maven W, Azure functions, run. And we'll see what happens. What could possibly go wrong? So make sure we still have our position function that's running. We still have plane finder that's running. So now we are building and running locally our aircraft function. That looks happy. So that's a good sign, right? So now if I just create another open window here, I'll just bring that back there, and we will pull our aircraft, or excuse me, our plane finder endpoint for aircraft. And if I go over there to our plane finder, we see that it's sending these out. We're seeing that it's getting back positions. You can see that based on the little radar symbol there, right? We're getting those back, and we're getting our aircraft responses back. We see that with our little aircraft. And then, of course, if we go and look at our different windows, different tabs, we can see that this is our position function. Everything worked properly, as we would expect, right? And that's working. And we go to our aircraft function. That also is working. Oh, it's a beautiful thing when things work first time out of the gate, right? All right. And this is what we get back from our aircraft, or from our plane finder itself. We get a list of position reports from aircraft in the area. So let's see if I can find one that's nice. There's a 737C7. I'm looking for the type here. Type Boeing 737. This is American Airlines 9A57. Well, actually, that's just the hex code, WN flight number. So that's Southwest Airlines 957, flight 957. And this will tell you the route. So DCA to St. Louis, to Lit, to Dallas, to Houston. And I'm trying to remember what Lit is. I just honestly don't remember. So, okay, so that's what happens. That's everything working. And that's using Azure functions for our two receiving functions that we're feeding information from an application to receive. Now that's running locally, right? And that's nice. But what I'm going to do is show you, I actually have these pre-deployed to the cloud because time is ever so short. And I wanted to make sure that, and I'm stopping both local functions, right? The aircraft and the position function. I'm going to go ahead and stop plane finder now. And I want to source something. Let's see, dev, does it set Azure functions? Let's see, shell. I believe that's right. Let's find out. Let's see. So env grep URL. Yes. Okay. So I actually have pre-deployed these to the cloud, the same functions, and I'm now pointing, or I'm going to send these values to cloud-based Azure functions. So let's go ahead and rerun this. Oh, heck, I'll just skip to it and retype it. So Spring Boot run. That'll be faster. So now what should happen if I pull this endpoint, the aircraft endpoint for plane finder, it should send these to two Azure functions running out in Azure, of course, and should get responses back. Now they're not pre-warmed, right? So this may take a little longer than would typically be expected, but we'll see what happens. I'll go back over here, and we see that it's pulled my device. It's gotten the latest information. It's sent these the positions and the aircraft information to different Azure functions running in the cloud, and it's gotten a response back. So everything is fine. Everything is happy, and that's a good, wonderful thing. Now, I want to show you kind of what's next in my mind, because that's showing you Spring Cloud Function and Azure functions, and that's a powerful combination. But there are different execution engines in Azure for like Python and C# and Java and JavaScript and what have you. So you may be wondering, gee, I didn't do anything native with this. I mean, it's standard JVM based Java code, right? I wonder if we could maybe pick things up a little bit if we went native. Wonder how we might do that. And Azure Functions has some native capabilities, but the capabilities that are language-based are so rich that I like to stay with that. But there are other ways to accomplish the same thing, right? So this is what I kind of like to show, because this is another option you have at your disposals, and that's called Azure Container Apps. And what Azure Container Apps does is it takes a a container, clever, right? It takes a container image and it deploys that as a container and runs that, and then will also scale to 0. So it's kind of accomplishing a similar outcome via a different mechanism, because it's a full-blown application, thin though it may be, but it can also scale up and scale down upon demand. So I'm going to show you how I go about doing that, and then tell you a little bit of a kind of a spoiler here at the end on why it might or might not make sense to do that. So I'm going to start off here at the top, and I'm going to just change things back in my POM to what I need to deploy this as an Azure Container App, or some things that are useful as well, and maybe not need, but I find very useful. So kind of some inside baseball, if you will. So I'm going to just comment these things out. Obviously, you'd remove them in a normal situation if you're going to do this, but I want to keep them there so you can kind of see the deltas. I'm going to change out or remove the thin layout version. I'm actually going to add this back. So this will look and remove, of course, the Spring Cloud function adapter for Azure. So this looks just like we had with Spring Cloud function, right? We have our Spring Cloud function context. We have our Spring Cloud starter function for Webflux. So we're back where we started, right? Except for the other stuff down here, which let's take a look at that. So I'm going to just remove the Spring Boot thin layout, right? But I am going to swap in something else, and this is just for convenience, right? So actually I want a container config. I have some live templates here because, I love the live code, but XML isn't really code. I mean, it's great. I mean, pom.xml is an awesome Maven build file, but it's not coding. And of course, this speeds things up a bit too. This is not required, but what I do with this is it streamlines the image creation and deployment the way I want it to occur, right? So I add this in because it just makes life a little bit easier downstream. And then, of course, all the stuff that we added in for our plugin for our Azure functions, that goes away because, again, right now we're not going to be building an Azure function. So all that we basically added, we have everything back exactly the way it was with Spring Cloud Functions, except I added this, which is optional. So that's kind of nice. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild that in Maven, or refresh that. We can close that and close that. All right, so the next thing I want to do is just comment out the server report. You can leave this, but then I have to go in and tweak this in the portal, which I'm not going to do. And then, of course, this stays the same. Our functions stay the same. The host.json we don't need. The local settings.json we don't need. It won't hurt anything, but we're not going to reference them. And we no longer have that portion of our POM that's referencing them, so they're just kind of useless. And I'm going to just disable this to where it's no longer loading as a component. In fact, I'm just going to comment all this out so you can see that it's not used at all. So we have a class called function component, which is empty, right? Doesn't do anything, and that's fine. Because again, I would normally just delete this, but for the purposes of the demo, it's, I think, instructive to see what all you get rid of and can deal with. Now, the other things that I'm going to do, a couple of things here. So go out to my function, and I'm going to, pardon me, I'm going to just make sure that I do a couple of things that are necessary to build this as a native image. So I'm going to, let me see if I can pull this up in memory, SDK, and I'm using the native image kit that's specified by the Spring team to build this as a native image, because what I want to do is use cloud native build packs to build a container image with a GraalVM based native executable. Sounds really good, right? And it basically is. So let's see. So /maven w, don't want the Spring Boot run. Actually, what I want to do is build image. So let's go ahead and build that image. And this will take a couple of minutes, but not really as long as you might imagine. So this allows you to use cloud native build packs, or Paketo build packs, sometimes they're called, to build an image, a Docker image, an OCI based image. And we're using GraalVM to build the application itself into a native executable, a native binary, if you will, for Linux in this case. Yeah, so 30 seconds and you're done. That's not too bad, right? So we have time. I was going to say, do I have to cut to the end, or can I actually do the full deployment? And I can do the full deployment. That's so good. So I'm going to just source a couple of files here that I have. And on my desktop, and I want the ACA init environment, because what I'm going to do is deploy this to Azure now. I have the time. I can do this. I'm so excited that I can actually do this. Otherwise, I kind of have to short circuit and just show you one that's running already. But let's do it for reals. Let's see. So there we go. And then what I want to do next is the config, and we'll push that out to the cloud. It's going ahead and updating an existing application. And that's the one I already had out there. In case we didn't have time, I could go ahead and just run it. But it's always nice to actually see it working, assuming it works, of course. Okay, so let me go back while that is loading up. I want to go make sure I get this covered before we run out of time. And then I'll come back and show you that all working. Hopefully, we'll find out. The suspense is killing me. All right. So if you want to know more, please do check out it's a meta repo called Let's Get Functional, but that meta repo points to all three of the other repositories. By the way, the Plane Finder, if you don't have a device already running in your house, you can create your own. You can configure your own using a Raspberry Pi and an antenna adapter, a converter. But if you don't want to do that, you can still run Plane Finder and it will go out and generate data. If it doesn't find anything at that local port, it'll go ahead and generate just a couple or three sample bits of data. So it still works. You also have your Azure function or Spring Cloud function for the aircraft and for the position. And of course, there are three different branches within each of those two functional repos. One for just Spring Cloud function, one for Spring Cloud function with Azure functions, and one for Spring Cloud function with Azure Container Apps. So please be aware of which branch you're on at the time, and it'll show you, kind of step you through the same way I did, as long as you follow the same progression. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please reach out to me via email, or better yet, on Twitter. That's why I have it big and bold, because that's the fastest way to reach me. And of course, the Spring Boot Book has a Twitter account as well. I will thank you for coming, but I'll thank you for coming again once we get to the end. I just wanted to make sure I threw that up there, because I sometimes forget, and then people say, how do I get your repo? That's how to get to the actual crux of the matter, the code itself. So let's go back and see if it's finished. It's running, so that's good. Almost there, and we're still great on time. We just have a couple of minutes left, and that's all it's going to take. So here we go. Now, you're probably wondering, what's the advantage of doing this way? And that's a great question. So let's go ahead and see. Oh, whoops, here we go. What I like to do is just do an even comparison, right? So I'm going to just do this. So we'll do a time HTTP, and I'm going to feed, there we go, our dev aircraft JSON. And this allows us to see what kind of time. Now that's let's see. Oh, of course, because I need to point to an actual endpoint. There we go. Works a little better when you go to the right place. Oh, just to keep it fair, let's do this. -B. Keep it bare and fair. So we see that our total round trip is 0.809, I guess I should say. So we've got some good total numbers here. Now, if I go back over here, and I'm just going to close that because I already have the URLs in place. So if I do a time, there we go. There's our functions. And I need to make sure I do a bare on this too, for a fair comparison. And you can tell I've got my timeout set pretty low, so it obviously took a little longer the first time out of the gate because it had gone idle. So we go ahead and run it again. We see that the numbers are pretty consistent, right? So 0.30 seconds user, 0.12 system, 0.12 second system, for a total of 0.8. So less than a second round trip to the cloud, process, and back. If we look over here, we see that it's 0.8, 0.809, 0.808. So here's the crux of it, in my opinion. You can go to a lot more trouble to build this, and it's true, Azure Container Apps gives you a little more flexibility. I mean, I do appreciate that, But Azure Functions is optimized to the point that you don't have to build a native image, a binary. You don't have to create a container image and deploy it. And you get effectively identical performance. Now, here is where it gets into the other side of things, because there are different execution metrics. There are different pricing metrics that are used for a certain number of executions that are included at no charge with your Azure account for Azure Functions. There are also a completely different number of metrics or kind of metrics that are used for a free executions of a scale to zero container application. So as with all things, even at any particular point in time, you're going to need to spin up a prototype and run that in both environments a certain limited amount of time and compare the pricing that would apply to you. And again, monitor that over time, because as different technology breakthroughs occur, as different pricing shifts, you may find that it affects you positively or negatively, and you want to be able to take advantage of that in either, well, in the positive sense. You don't want any nasty surprises. So it's always good to be aware of that on top of that, and then to have those options. Now, the one thing I will say is that container apps done this way, as you recall, takes you right back to that very much Spring Cloud Function approach. I mean, I added this. That was entirely optional. You don't have to have that, especially if you have a build pipeline that factors in all of these things. Again, it makes my life a little easier, but everything is exactly the same as it was with Spring Cloud Function. And you're deploying this to an Azure Container App. So it makes that kind of nice. The thing that Azure Functions does give you is the ability to execute triggers based on any number of different stimuli, right? So again, that messaging platform, a Kafka trigger, a database trigger of various different kinds, an HTTP trigger, and that gives you a lot of power and flexibility that way as well. So again, the choice is up to you. It's really good to have a lot of good choices, and you have them. So we'll go back to here, and I'll wrap it up. So again, thank you very much for coming. Please check out the repo, star and watch it, because I will be making updates as things go along. And reach out to me on Twitter, email, whatever. And have a great day. Have a great evening.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Phenomenal session. I mean,
Thanks so much.
all the way from the very broad delineation at the start, right? So when do you do an app versus when you do a function? I think it's very, very instructive, very appropriately layered. Took us through the whole basics and all the way to deployment and stuff like that. Extraordinarily done, and then all through shot through with characteristic wit and verb. So thanks a lot for doing this on behalf of everyone here. Thanks a lot for joining us and doing this really special webinar.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So have a great day, and we hope to bring you back for another session sometime soon.
Already looking forward to it. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.